Okay, so the state of Coahuila, Tejas, and Saltillo, it doesn't abolish slavery completely, but it puts pretty severe restrictions on the future of slavery. And Austin and his Tejano allies worked very hard to undermine the restrictions that are put on slavery by this legislature. The Article 13 of the Coahuila Constitution. By the way, I'm not going to test you on Article 13. It's just a little bit too detailed for this course. The big thing I want you to know is that the Constitution of the state of Coahuila, it didn't end slavery, but it put pretty tight restrictions on the future of slavery, which Stephen F. Austin and his Tejano allies worked to undermine. Um, and I just want to remind you of something that I've said a bunch. For Austin and his Anglo allies, that they felt like the future of Texas had to be a future that existed with slavery. As I said in class on Tuesday, Austin wanted Texas to be part of Mexico, but what he wanted Texas to be the one slave state in Mexico. For him, slavery was a non negotiable item. He knew that no Anglos would come, or very, very few Anglos would come into Texas if they couldn't bring their slaves. And so the whole point of his colonization scheme is to get enough Anglos into Texas with their slaves to start growing cotton, to start taking part in this global cotton economy. So he's just absolutely focused on bringing slaves into Texas. As I talked about, uh, and as Torget talks about, the subterfuge that Austin uses to get slaves into Texas is that he classifies slaves coming into Texas as apprentices. And that they should, the folks coming in to Texas with their slaves, these slaves were not classified as slaves, they were classified as apprentices, but they had to work for 99 years. And these poor slaves, they were taken to a notary public, and they put their, very few could read or write because they weren't allowed to learn how to read or write. They would put their X on a document where it said that they agreed to be apprentices. Now, if you were an apprentice, i.e., a slave, and you came into Texas and you had a child in Texas, that child would have been a slave, or not a slave, would be regarded as an apprentice, and would have to work for the master for 25 years without pay. So, this undermining of any anti slavery provisions, just to repeat, so the adults that are coming in, or the existing slaves that are coming in, they don't come into Texas as slaves, they come into apprentices. But even beyond that, the slaves agree, and I'm putting air quotes around agree because they don't know what they're signing. They agree that any children, any slave children born in Texas, will be unpaid apprentices for 25 years. Okay, so that locks children of these folks into a system of slavery, although it's by another name. But even more insidious, what would happen is if you were born in Texas, you would start accruing debt to the master because the master would give you clothes, would feed you, and the master would charge you for all these basic necessities of life, of course, without paying you for your labor. So by the time a slave child born in Texas was 25, that young adult of 25 would be in such debt to the master that they would have to stay in an apprenticeship relation to the master. So here's the point. The point is that slaves that came into Texas as apprentices, it was a system designed that so they could never escape slavery, right? It wasn't called slavery, it was called apprenticeship, but it was slavery, and it was designed to trap the people, the slaves coming into Texas, but it was also designed to trap their children as well, and their children's children into a lifetime of servitude. So that's how slavery gets introduced into Texas, and as I said before, it's very successful um, from an economic point of view. From just basic humanity, of course, it's a complete disaster, and it's a running wound that still is part of our society to this very day. But in sheer economics, by the end of the 1820s, Texas was exporting up to 450,000 pounds of cotton annually. So almost immediately, Texas starts growing massive amounts of cotton, and this is just the beginning. By 1860, Texas is exporting millions and millions and millions of pounds of cotton, but very quickly the cotton production takes off in Texas, and economically, uh, the slave economy of Texas is very much tied to New Orleans. It's not tied to Mexico. In New Orleans, it's New Orleans and New Orleans merchants, because remember, New Orleans is a very wealthy city. They're the ones that supply credit to the Texans. New Orleans merchants do. They're the ones that sell Texans the seed that they need, the farm equipment that they need, the clothes that they need. So not only is Texas growing cotton, and slaves are coming into Texas and are technically protected. But economically, Texas is enmeshed in an economy that New Orleans is at the center at. New Orleans is the economic capital of Texas. It's where Texans, as I said, look for credit, look for farm materials, look for clothes. So, what we're seeing here, big picture, is that Anglo Texas, or okay, it's Mexican Texas, but in terms of population, it's being dominated by Anglos. It also is an economy that's tied far more closely to New Orleans than it is to any place in Mexico. So basically, by around 1830 or so, what's happened to Texas is it's become more American than it is Mexican. You've got the slavery coming in. You've got the growth of cotton. Where's the cotton going? It's going into the states of the U.S. Northeast. Credit financing material is coming from New Orleans, and so the Mexican government, by the end of the 1830s, is starting to realize that it's made a major, major mistake in allowing basically the foxes into the hen house. That they'd made a bet, it was a bad bet, but they didn't have many choices. They made a bet that Anglo Americans would come into Texas and would become Mexicanized and would become good Mexican citizens. Well, by the end of the 1820s, they realized that they made a terrible mistake. Although there's probably not too much they could have done, regardless. But anyway, they realized that they made a terrible mistake. And what we're going to start to see now for the next week or so is the domino effect that's going to lead Texas out of Mexico and into the status, at least for a decade, as an independent nation.